Hi, welcome back. So I know it's been a while since my last video, and I am still very much in the middle of a lot of projects, but I thought in order to try to get back involved in the channel, I would try to address a few random topics that I think is very important for people to kind of understand what the modern history academia field looks like, what does history in general look like, and what we mean when certain narratives in history change. And the issue of trying to reach out to people with what these changes are. So, as many of you have probably figured out in my previous episodes, especially involving Reconstruction history, interpretations of the American Revolution, history in general can be taken into a lot of different fields. There are social histories, military history, political histories, cultural histories, histories that focus on the environment and environmental impact, like history of the fur trade. Then there are histories that are meant to be more for public consumption. Uh, these are called popular histories. These histories are less about academic rigor and reaching a larger audience. These are your historical dramas, your biographies, especially the founders chic era of the late 1990s, early 2000s, when you had all these books about Washington, Adams, Jefferson, uh, Hamilton, especially the musical, was part of the founder chic era. Now, there is nothing wrong with popular history. I myself, even after getting my master's in history, do enjoy a good biography. But if we're talking about like actually tackling harder subjects, citations, books that are more widely accepted in academic fields, you have your monographs. Your academic histories are peer-reviewed articles, peer-reviewed books that take anywhere from half a year to 2 to 3 years to get through all the editing processes, peer reviews, and to be published. Academic histories in general have to add to the overall narrative. This narrative is called historiography. Historiographies can, especially in US history, they're usually lined up as originist thought, revisionist, and post-revisionist. It's a bit more complicated than that, especially if you've seen my American Revolution episodes. How things are more how things usually are is you have your Whig, your more divine right of the American founding. Then you have your progressives who focus more on economics. Then you have your post-war, World War II, early Cold War consensus. Everyone was kind of on the same page of a founding. Then you have your revisionist / leftist view of it, where the focus is more on the civil rights movement that was happening at the time, which focused more on minority views, what things were like for, say, Native Americans, African Americans, people who weren't the majority. Then you have your post-revisionist, which kind of takes the consensus and revisionist point of view and look at original source materials and use different social studies fields. For instance, take things apart, try to look at societal views and lenses like a sociologist's view. Economics, especially, is still a very large part of the methodology of modern post-revisionism. Then you have psychology, you have your political sciences. Basically, academic history, the reason why we say history is being rewritten, it's more of history is being looked through different narratives by looking at advances in theories, advances in worldviews. It's this dichotomy of the past is an alien place and yet it is so familiar. Like, how many modern concepts still link us to our past, while certain practices, like the fact that some version of witch hunting, some version of these practices that we find so disgusting, still were part of our nation's past, even during the founding era. For instance, if we look at the history of China, women's foot binding, where women's feet were intentionally broken and kept from healing right because of the beauty standards of petite feet. That lasted well into the 1900s, like early 1900s, like the founding of the Chinese Republic. So the reason why academic histories don't usually make it out into a larger audience is, in a lot of ways, they aren't intended for a wider audience. They are meant to be dissected, disseminated, then taught in classrooms. And a lot of times, for academic histories to become mainstream, it takes a very long time for that to be passed on. And even then, you have to understand with education systems, a lot of times, whether or not a wider society can take a change in historical narrative, especially with how things like, for instance, accepting that our founders were very much people of their time, that yes, did have some liberal views of their time, still had practices like slavery, issues of women's rights, even with like Abigail Adams saying, "Don't forget the women," who wrote a will that very explicitly made mentions to her female relatives and tried to present her a level of property independent from her husband that just wasn't done at that time. Like, yes, you have these views, and in some cases, because of loopholes in state laws, some women in the New England area did have the right to vote, but because of populism that kind of entered the Jacksonian Revolution, a lot of these women lost their right to vote that because of state loopholes they had. So it's that dichotomy of understanding the past for what it is, but still understanding that it is both familiar and alien to us. This is kind of why historiography does, especially academic historiography, doesn't always land, like, especially in states that have more control over history curriculums that have a rough time understanding that we do have the right to say a lot of our founders were slave owners, or discussing the fact that the Confederacy was for certain founded on slavery, and a lot of people still had interest in slavery even if they weren't slave owners. Like, just saying these things that have been facts in academic histories for years upon years just did not make it into popular histories and popular understandings until recently, and a lot of times that can be how we dictate popular history, and how the difference between private interests and public history. Now, public histories are, for instance, your museums, your public exhibits, your, and even to some extent, academically funded online history archives. These are these are public histories because they are meant for public consumption, and usually are meant to be free for the public to kind of understand and get quick history lessons. A lot of times these are local efforts, especially on the county level. And a lot of what they're meant to do is have a topic, a message, and have it there for the public and be organized. So why am I mentioning all this? Why have I been going on for almost 15 minutes on all this? And a lot of that is because when history is mentioned, it is less about what the big air quotes truth is. A lot of times, especially history in a memory context, it can be biased by perspective, biased by our own biases. Like, the reason why history can never be the full truth or full fact is because that's not what historiography or history is. History is based on how we can view things from a societal view, how we can view things from a historical view, like disseminate the facts based on this lens. It's like that saying of, if you have a bunch of blind people touching an elephant, they're touching parts that can help us understand the full thing, yet the full thing can never be fully described because you're only feeling one part. Now, and as for like how public history makes academic history look, right now we are entering an era where the history field in itself is expanding. For instance, I went to UNK, go Lopes. We are expanding into fields of societal views of homelessness, the language of homeless populations. The overall history field in the last 40 years has widely accepted that LGBT histories are an important factor of how we view history. feminist historian feminist historians are very big. Also, if you want a good LGBT history, especially that looks at New York, I highly recommend the monograph Gay New York. And especially lately, history has become more of a women's field, where a lot of women are slowly becoming the majority of academic historians, especially in the university setting. So, the reason why I'm doing all this is because while historians do stay in the ivory towers, a lot of attempts at getting academic history into a more public and popular sphere so that people can understand that why there's this disconnect, why a lot of academic and historians, why a lot of teachers are talking about how we need to upgrade the standards of history, especially in elementary, middle, and high schools, is because a lot of our books are still in the consensus era of the late 1940s through the 1950s. For high schools to catch up, touching on things of what was important of the revisionist era and entering the post-revisionist era needs to happen. And that does mean that taking more of a Marxist historian approach, aka using social studies to disseminate histories and just kind of breaking this mold of not everyone was on the same page of what our nation was going to be. It wasn't this divine manifest destiny. It was a lot of times understanding what being the United States or what even being a nation was. Not everyone was on the same page. Everyone had interests. Everyone had biases. So, and even history YouTube, like, we do have some academic historians. We have the cynical historian who does take pieces of what even an intro level history college course is and kind of breaking down a lot of barriers of what historiography is. I can only give you a general idea because while I did go to school to become a historian, that isn't my job, that isn't my field. And what I can do is give you what I was taught. Have a good rest of your day.